Hi, everyone. I'm Jay Wong, Director of the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. I am welcoming you to our program from the USA Pavilion at the World Expo in Dubai. And I'm standing right in front of our pavilion here. As many of you know, the World Expo is arguably the single largest public diplomacy event in the world. The center has been undertaking a multi-year project to examine the function and the enduring value of this enormous event in global affairs. We will share more about the Dubai Expo in the coming weeks. Today's event focuses on information capability and defense. The dynamism of contemporary global information environment underscores an essential role of strategic communication for government agencies with international concerns, including the military. So what does information capability mean in this context for the military? And how should the efforts be aligned with the other agencies and partners? I am very, very delighted to introduce Marie Royce, who will introduce our speaker and moderate today's discussion. Marie Royce has a distinguished career in both the private and public sectors as a businesswoman, diplomat, and educator. She was a Fortune 500 executive for over 25 years at world-renowned companies, including Procter & Gamble, Marriott International, and Nokia Alcatel-Lucent. She currently serves on the board of Cognitive Health. Marie was unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate to serve as Assistant Secretary of State for Educational and Cultural Affairs. She oversaw the presidentially appointed Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board and the presidentially appointed Cultural Property Advisory Committee. She led the creation and launch of the Academy of Women Entrepreneurs in 80 countries. Marie has held leadership positions on 24 nonprofit boards. Last but not least, she is a distinguished member of CPD's Advisory Board. Marie, hello from Dubai. Thank you so much for joining us and for your support of the Center's work. I now turn the program over to you.
All right, so great to see you, Jay, out in at the expo, and I'm so pleased that you could join us. I want to say thank you so much for that kind introduction, and of course, it's such a pleasure to introduce our speaker today, summarize his article, and also moderate this session. Let me start with the introduction. For Lieutenant Colonel Gregory M. Tomlin, PhD. Greg is a U.S. Army officer presently assigned to the Army staff in the Pentagon. Throughout his military career, Greg has written articles about information operations, strategic communications, and public diplomacy. He's spoken about these topics at the U.S. Department of State, at universities, and also at think tanks. He is co-author of The Gods of Diyala, Transfer of Command in Iraq, and author of Murrell's Cold War, Public Diplomacy for the Kennedy Administration. He's been deployed to Iraq and Kosovo. He's been assigned to Germany and the Republic of South Korea. He served in the White House as a military social aide for President Obama and Mrs. Obama. And he served as the Joint Staff in the Pentagon as Chief of Targeting Doctrine and Policy. As an assistant professor of history at the U.S. Military Academy, he taught courses on American and Cold War history, earning the department's top teaching award in 2013. He's a distinguished military graduate of College of Women at William and Mary's ROTC program and earned his doctorate in history from the George Washington University. Greg, I want to say thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I really enjoyed having the opportunity to read your article. And for those who have not read the article, I wanted to just summarize it for you. And this is the article. Hopefully you'll be able to read that, and it will be available in the chat. And the name of the article is The Case for an Information Warfighting Function. And I will just say that it may be summarized by these 3 points. First, I want to say that the article begins as a historical analysis of the US government's approach to influence operations during the Cold War and also the information age. And then it proposes benefits that the Army would gain by approaching the information environment with the same level of discipline as it does the air and ground dimensions of any area of operations. Second, Greg argues for the establishment of information as the US Army's 7th warfighting function to enable ground force commanders to shape the information domain as part of all military operations. And last, Greg notes that his recommendations would help the Army win the competitive advantage against its adversaries by investing as heavily in the development of future information capabilities as it does in creating artificial intelligence collection assets and extended range fires delivery platforms. Greg, I'm now going to turn it over to you for your remarks. And then afterwards, I'm going to ask you a few questions. And lastly, I'm going to ask the members of the audience to please ask some questions in the chat, which I'll ask you, and then we'll do a wrap up. But at this point now, I'd like to just say thank you again for the opportunity to moderate this session and to discuss the article. And I'm going to now turn it over to you. So, Greg, and also again, note that the article will be shared with you as a web link so that you can read it. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Marie. I appreciate that very much. 5 years ago, I received my first invitation to speak at the Center on Public Diplomacy when my book, Murrow's Cold War, was first published. When Edward R. Murrow served as director of the U.S. Information Agency, he challenged his public affairs officers to wear out more shoe leather and fewer typewriter ribbons to engage the global public. That guidance remains salient for foreign service officers working in the public diplomacy cone today. When you look across the globe, however, you will notice there are far more Americans in combat boots treading around than diplomats in leather shoes. Now, please don't misconstrue this comment as criticism of the State Department. Rather, it reinforces the importance of this topic, which I write about in my recent article, on the need for an information warfighting function for the U.S. Army. The views I will offer today are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the United States Army or the Department of Defense. I am not new to this discussion, as Marie said, and my ideas on how to enhance information operations and strategic communications have appeared in a variety of peer-reviewed journals over the past few years, including Joint Force Quarterly and Military Review. As Professor Nick Cole at the CPD has taught us, public diplomacy is an international actor's attempt to conduct foreign policy by engaging foreign publics through 5 core components: listening, advocacy, exchange diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, and international broadcasting. The Army could play a more deliberate role in all 5 components with existing soft power capacity. We can listen, we can advocate with those boots on the ground. We can support cultural diplomacy with the band concerts and the friendship festivals that we hold overseas where we station our soldiers. We can provide support for exchange diplomacy because we already host hundreds of foreign military officers at our U.S. Army schools in the United States, and abroad we send thousands of advisors and guest instructors to train with other militaries. And even in international broadcasting, we have the Armed Forces Network that provides English-speaking radio and entertainment and television, both in Asia and in Europe. And we're not the only ones who are listening in on what we're talking about. I think we can do better at synchronizing these efforts with the State Department. Now, in 2017, then Defense Secretary Mattis established information as a joint function. The other joint functions being command and control, intelligence, fires, protection, and sustainment. The Secretary charged the department to consider the implications of this 7th joint function across doctrine, organizations, education, and personnel. Now, up to this point, the Army has made every joint function one of its own warfighting functions. Now, I don't want to get bogged down today in Army doctrine, but I do need to explain what a warfighting function is. It's a group of tasks and systems that are united by a common purpose that a commander can use to accomplish any military mission. Army leaders have argued that information is integral to the other warfighting functions, so it would not be necessary to become one itself. In my experience, however, from the brigade level to the joint staff, this is problematic because commanders are not required by our own doctrine to integrate and synchronize information capabilities into combat operations or prioritize it into other forms of military operations. A warfighting function builds a requirement in Army doctrine on how to maneuver a tank, for example, in the desert, or how far behind enemy lines we could drop paratroopers. We organize units based on those doctrinal requirements, the number of fuelers, for example, that would be required for those tanks moving in the desert, or the percentage of additional soldiers to give to an airborne unit because we know there will be injuries on the drop zone. We educate soldiers based on our standardized curriculum. I knew as a battalion commander in Washington State that newly arriving soldiers were taught to perform the same skills to the same standard as those soldiers assigned to my previous units in Korea, Germany, and Texas. We know how to man a unit to complete doctrinal tasks. We send tracked mechanics to a tank battalion, and we send helicopter technicians to an aviation brigade. So if information is not a warfighting function, how do commanders know how to prioritize and integrate influence operations in the information domain? How can they be held accountable for the quality of their information campaign during extended deployments when it is not scrutinized as closely as how well they prepare their soldiers to close with and kill the enemy? Where does information operations belong? Is it part of intelligence? Is it part of fires? Is it part of protection then? We often default by telling the field artillery officer to synchronize information operations like cannon and mortar fires, but these capabilities are not the same. We force information operations into a targeting cycle, and we label friendly individuals and audiences as targets. Now, in counterinsurgency warfare, yes, a terrorist leader would be a high-value target. But in any conflict, would you label a pro-American provincial leader as a target? How about all of the women in Afghanistan? Yet these individuals and these audiences need to be engaged in a methodical manner, but commanders do not approach them the same way from one region of the world or operation to the next. What about when we're not in conflict, but still need to influence a host nation population in humanitarian operations, telling them where to find food? In peacekeeping operations, why it's important to respect the rule of law during peacekeeping operations. Is it a job for the Army? Absolutely. Don't forget about those thousands of Americans stationed overseas in Germany, Italy, Korea, and Japan, and deployed for short durations to exercises from Poland, India, to Thailand, among dozens of other countries. The Army prioritizes resources based on the potential threats and our adversaries. Yet it may not be a large-scale war 5 to 10 years from now that will frustrate our ability to protect the homeland or preserve global interests. A significant national security threat may be the absence of historic partners in Europe and in Asia, or the rejection of democratic norms that we have taken for granted. Public opinion polls in Europe indicate that increasing numbers of people question the value of NATO and defense cooperation. Russian propaganda in Eastern Europe has effectively influenced the Russian-speaking minorities to believe they have more in common with Russia than the European Union. In the Philippines last year, President Duarte publicly warned his people that continued military cooperation with the United States could lead to war with China and the extinction of the Filipino race. And this fear wasn't generated by a physical threat made by China, but rather by the deftness of the CCP's non-lethal engagements across the Indo-Pacific. It is in this information space where we will fail to set the conditions to preserve collective security. To win the competitive advantage that may prevent the next war, the Army must invest as heavily in the information capabilities as it does in artificial intelligence for reconnaissance and extended range artillery. An information warfighting function will require commanders from the tactical to the strategic levels to deliberately prioritize, integrate, and synchronize information operations into all operations. If we can do this as a branch of the military, it'll make it easier to contribute to the joint force and a whole of government approach to influence operations. The genesis of my talk and even this article came from a phone conversation Jay and I had last fall about ways that the military could possibly collaborate with the Center on Public Diplomacy. In my view, we need common terms of reference to elevate the importance of leveraging the Army's capacity to, for example, 1, inform the Global Engagement Center at the State Department with information on public opinions gleaned from month-long deployments and engagements with senior military and civic leaders. 2, to enhance the value of USAID efforts at the same locations in the developing world where we find Army units, particularly the Corps of Engineers and medical units. And 3rd, more broadly, we can complement the public diplomacy efforts of the State Department by knowing the messages of the US Embassy in the same country where we deploy for training. Collaboration with the State Department may lead to expanding the requirement for influence operations and thus justify the need to expand the budget for public diplomacy and strategic communication initiatives across our government. The forthcoming Army Operations Manual, called Field Manual 3.0, prioritizes the need to counter adversary malign activity during competition below armed conflict in ways that preserve stability and protect our interests. This is difficult to do with our current prioritization of information resources. The United States closed its information agency in 1999 as a Cold War relic, but our greatest competitors have not. President Putin's formative KGB career led him to invest heavily in state-operated RT and Radio Sputnik as president of Russia. The RT Arabic language channel is one of the most trusted news sources in the Middle East, despite the disinformation woven into their reporting. Several years ago, I used to watch RT about 30 minutes every day just to see what was going on. And during the height of the effort to retake southern Syria, northern Iraq from ISIS, there was an image of bodies rolled up in carpets on the side of a street in Syria. And the reporter from RT said that there were reports that indiscriminate American bombing were killing civilians. And then they moved on to the next story, which had to do with international markets. There's a problem with this story. The journalist never clarified who was the eyewitness. We don't know if it's just somebody with a rumor. We don't know if it was somebody from the Syrian government, a Russian observer. There was no context, but it was simply woven into a matter-of-fact way that you would watch news on BBC, CNN, or Fox News. The Russians have a refined and sophisticated information operations campaign towards the Russian-speaking minorities today in the Ukraine and Baltic states, and that's creating divisions that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago when the wall fell. And for years, China's manipulation of the information domain focused internally to control the domestic narrative on the internet, both for news and social media. But since the COVID pandemic, we've seen the CCP take a page out of the Kremlin's playbook to advance an offensive misinformation campaign to suggest that the US government may be responsible for the virus. A foreign ministry spokesman tweeted about a US soldier bringing COVID to China during the October 2019 military World Games. He also wrote that the US Army developed COVID at Fort Detrick, Maryland, the same biolab where Soviets said we created AIDS during the 1980s. Now the information domain is further complicated by the US exit from Afghanistan. Russian and Chinese messages say that we do not keep our promises and that we will not defend our partners. In the coming months and years, what will Russia do with this example in the Ukraine? And how does this perception of American isolationism affect the CCP's view of reclaiming Taiwan? It is not sufficient for us to only consider information operations when we deploy to combat. We need to prioritize messaging and speak consistently from that strategic corporal to the four-star general. Right now, the Army culture continues to look at this requirement as an afterthought. And as I have witnessed on deployments and training exercises, it's not effective. An information warfighting function would force us to seriously consider what tools to develop further. Civil affairs, psychological operations, information operations, cyber capabilities. Cyber capabilities are very important, and much of what the Chinese and Russians are doing, we know, is affected by the internet and social media, manipulation of the news. But that, again, is only one dimension of the information domain. And I think sometimes we prioritize that too much. We put too much money and interest in that. There is an information operations functional area where officers and soldiers in the Army can spend their career doing information operations. Several years ago, we took the information operations officer out of the brigade combat team. Now, the heart of the United States Army, in my view, are our brigade combat teams. There's about 30 of them, 4,500 soldiers that we can deploy around the world. Deploy them to Afghanistan to bring civilians out, deploy them to Haiti to help after the earthquake, deploy them to Korea to deter North Korean aggression, deploy them to Poland to enhance NATO operations. Every time that we send one of these 4,500 man units out, what they're lacking is someone that they had only 10 years ago. As a major, a mid-career officer who is an information operations officer, trained to look at information, trained to integrate civil affairs, psychological operations, look at the interagency ability to enhance the public diplomacy of the State Department. And yet that role was taken away. And when I talk to colleagues who are information operations officers at the lieutenant colonel, at the colonel rank, they are concerned about going or advising junior information operation officers to go to the tactical level, because that's not where they're going to get promoted. They're going to get promoted if they support cybercom, if they support the Army component of cybercom. And that is an attraction to them. And that is important, but that's only one dimension. So that is what I offer in the article, is that if we begin by simply saying information has to be integrated and synchronized the way I integrate the reconnaissance effort, the way I integrate the artillery, the way I think about protection against chemical attacks, the way I sustain them with food and water and fuel. I can't fail in those 6 dimensions. When I go to a training exercise, I'm evaluated on my 6 warfighting functions. And if I struggle, if I'm in an exercise where there is a fake civilian town, if there's a fake civilian leader, it's not as significant as it would be if I failed to send the reconnaissance out in advance, understand where the enemy is situated, before I deploy soldiers into harm's way, before I send them into a blind trap. I would be critiqued for that. As an artillery officer, I would be critiqued if I didn't have the right ammunition on the guns to support the missions. I would be critiqued if I didn't have enough ammunition out there to shoot the missions I need to. Because as an artilleryman, if I don't kill the enemy or if I don't damage that bunker, the infantry are going to dismount, they're going to approach that bunker, and there'll be far more machine guns and enemy soldiers that can potentially kill those Americans. We want to build standoff distance. We want to preserve those democratic norms. We want to show the world that there's an importance to having cooperation through defense security. And where we can improve that greatly, I believe, is by saying that information operations is just as important as those 6 warfighting functions. To do that, we need the doctrine, we'll build the skill set, we'll equip the units, and I believe we'll see the benefits. Thank you, Marie.
All right, great. Well, thank you. That was a illuminating overview of the article, and I really appreciated that. And I especially appreciated the examples that you just provided. I wanted to, at this point, Greg, to ask you a few questions, and then, as noted before, I look very forward to the audience participating and putting in questions in the chat, which I'll ask you. But my first question for you is basically, you've done a very thorough analysis of information warfighting in the military, and I want to say thank you for that overview, and I basically applaud you for that. But I'd like to ask you for your thoughts about how DoD strategy does or should fit with other parts of the U.S. government.
I think that's hugely important. My doctoral research focused on the U.S. Information Agency. And I know that there is not a political appetite to rebuild the U.S. Information Agency today. There is the Global Engagement Center at the State Department. There is the U.S. Agency for Global Media that is responsible for our international broadcasting. And there are opportunities where I think we can integrate better with them, but step back for a moment and look at things that the U.S. Information Agency did, because that was their focus, was public diplomacy, that other competing priorities prevent the Office of Public Affairs at the Defense Department, your office at the State Department, from always being focused on, because there are other competing requirements. And one of those things that I think is most important is research and analysis specific to public opinion. At the USIA, they had a division for research and analysis. Where could we reconstruct that today, where we are getting information from Army intelligence, Defense Intelligence Agency, informing the intelligence community, informing the State Department, informing the National Security Council on how effective our international broadcasting is, how effective is our exchange diplomacy, the cultural diplomacy that Jay is standing at in Dubai today. Who is really doing that assessment to ensure that it shouldn't just be the State Department serving as the leader for that pavilion, but maybe it's helpful if the Department of Commerce, Department of Agriculture is more involved. And when we look at the developing world, how do we make sure that USAID is informing decisions that are being made across the United States government?
That's great. Well, thank you very much for that. And by the way, I was sharing with Jay right when he came on that I had an opportunity last November to actually attend the ceremony when we actually kind of launched the pavilion. For those on the line, this pavilion was supposed to happen last year in 2020. And of course, with COVID-19, got pushed to October. But we're very fortunate to be involved in this and having the USA Pavilion. And as Jay was sharing earlier, we're right next to Kazakhstan, and I believe there's about 95 different pavilions. So we are very excited to be part of this expo, and we are actually promoting, when I did my walkthrough last year, so that was all pre-opening, we're promoting the United States as a destination for education, as an example, and you noted the commerce aspect, and I think that's incredibly important. We also want people to do business with the United States. Now, another question that I have for you is basically, you mentioned the GEC. For those on the line, that's the Global Engagement Center. You talked about that in your article. The GEC was established to counter disinformation and propaganda, and it really serves as the coordination nexus across all aspects of the United States government. You also wrote that it's under-resourced. The GEC, you probably may know, but it's been doing some remarkable things the last 2 years. Even though it's had little funding, it brought together top expertise and a way to lead and coordinate through a global technology platform that it just built in the last 2 years. The technology tools included artificial intelligence and machine learning tools. And it's a way for partners to coordinate with the US government and across all platforms. So my question to you is really, wouldn't you agree that perhaps more funding for the GEC would actually help with integration across the US government? Because really that's the GEC's mandate.
Yes, Marie, I completely agree that it needs to be funded. And perhaps if we really look at it as a whole of government center, that some of that funding can come outside of the State Department. And then leadership, I think, is important as well. Our leaders at the State Department, leaders at the National Security Council, leaders in the administration emphasizing or showcasing the GEC as something that could be vital and attracting the right leaders, whether they're coming out of private industry, as you had before you joined the State Department, or they're career civil servants. Maybe they're outside of the State Department, but they have dynamic ideas on how to make that center even better than it is. There are specific examples of where they've done very well, but it's the limits of the funding. And a very good friend of mine sent me information paper that he wrote coming out of a year in Afghanistan. And it talked about Army information operations and ways that they can enhance their interagency support. And I read something very similar to that about 10 years ago from people that were working in Iraq, from an experience for that. If we put more money into the GEC, then just like making a warfighting function for the Army, we can make it more sustainable. And it's not something that's unique and that, wow, this was very good at countering what the Russian disinformation campaign was in Ukraine. But there are techniques that we can share and understand that might be effective in the Indo-Pacific region or perhaps in Africa as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that response. I'm going to deviate a little bit from my moderating, and I'm going to skip to the chat because I'm excited that we've got a few really great questions coming in. Basically, I'm going to just ask about this again. I'm now having a little trouble seeing this. Just a sec. I might have to skip to my other question. I'm going to ask, there we go. I wanted to ask you this question, Greg. How do you compare and contrast military information operations and public affairs as domains of doctrine and practice? This is from the chat.
There's a lot of sensitivity from professional public affairs officers about being lumped in with information operations. There's a perception that information operations is about deception. And that's unfortunate because 20 years ago, the first time I was looking at information operations as a lieutenant, as a peacekeeper deployed to Kosovo, And they looked at what are the components of information operations. One of the leading components was public affairs. And I mentioned earlier that we have the Armed Forces Network, which is an entertainment program, radio and television for soldiers deployed around the world. But I know for a fact in Korea and Germany, there are plenty of Germans and Koreans who are listening to that. And it's the pop culture entertainment piece, but they're also listening to the news. What's being reported on those? And so public affairs is something that I think is integral to good information operations. That you as a commander bring your public affairs officer into the deliberation and discussions and not just react because there was a catastrophe and we dropped a bomb on the wrong building. Now go and police that up. It is important that we build relationships with the media and the press, and you can't do that without the insight of your public affairs officer. So if your brigade combat team deploys, you do have a major, again, a mid-level Army officer who is a public affairs officer trained in the schoolhouse, but how is he empowered? Where does he sit at the team? If you have an operations center that's highly mobile and the commander is taking only a handful of people with him, who does he take? He's probably taking his lawyer with him. He should probably take his public affairs officer as well. But then how do you equip in a foreign country that public affairs officer to identify, to reach out, to collaborate with the local media, to start to build those relationships that allow you to build the credibility? Public affairs officers in the State Department who are working at embassies are doing this in earnest, and they've got the longevity. In the military, it's a bit more complicated because if I'm in the public affairs cone or public diplomacy cone and I arrive at the embassy in Paris, I know there's a Rolodex of contacts, and I probably have some overlap with the former press attaché who can invite me to a cafe and meet with people before they leave. There's a handoff there. But in a military unit, you may be the first to arrive on the scene, such as in Haiti for a humanitarian operation, or you may arrive later into a theater that we spent 20 years in, like Afghanistan, 15 years like Iraq, and you didn't have that handoff. And you sometimes find yourself at square one trying to figure out where to go. That's where the information operations officer can help to synchronize public affairs as one of those elements with the civil affairs, with the psychological operations, with the cyber officer perhaps, all those other elements that can help to engage with, provide messages, and then assess. Someone has to be listening to all this, and the public affairs officer is highly critical for that.
That's great. Well, thank you for that. By the way, for those of you who don't know, USC launched the Innovation Prize, and I really strongly encourage people to look up USC for more information on it. But they had 2 public affairs officers that just received the prize from Poland. They're for the U.S. Embassy, and they had such an innovative initiative. So going back to your point about public affairs officers and the importance of that, and also the importance of coordinating, I think that's really important. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask another question from the chat. Greg, what are your thoughts about the Russian army's increasing reliance on information operations?
It's very concerning, and it really is not new. It's been drawn to our attention more recently, but if you look back since Putin first was president and he went away and came back as president, he has made sure that this is very important with RT and Radio Sputnik, as I mentioned. Those are forms of international broadcasting, but he is empowering the military to focus on it. It is in their strategic document that the military is going to win in the information domain. And we saw from their operations in Syria, we're seeing in the Baltics right now, in the Ukraine, that it is something that we have to consider. And so I'm an artillery officer. We have recognized that the Russians have artillery that can shoot further than us. And so the Army has a futures command that spends a lot of money looking at how to build hypersonic missiles, extended range cannons and rockets, so that we can be as effective, if not more, than the Russian artillery. But when it comes to information, that's where I think we need to have a requirement built, and an information warfighting function would help us to understand how to approach information units that exist inside of the Russian army, information units that are in cyberspace, that are on the ground, and that are very effective. We have to counter them, and it takes an investment in funding, just like more funding for the GEC. If we want the GEC to be more effective, you get the resources there. And you get resources like funding because there's a requirement. And we need in the Army a requirement that would come by looking at it that way.
Okay, thank you very much for that robust answer. I have a good question here from the U.S. military, and I'll just share that with you now. Could you please shed light on how information warfighting, in your view, is distinct from public affairs?
Yes. So public affairs is simply we're informing individuals. But I like the term influence operations. Some of our other allies use that instead of information operations because we're seeking to influence them. It could be in a peacekeeping operation to respect the rule of law. When I was in Kosovo, one of our basic things was you need to participate in the elections. You need to do that to really build a democracy. You need to respect your neighbor who is a Serbian because the war is over and it's only together that you're going to rebuild your country, become part of Europe. In Iraq, we had a need to influence individuals to call us at the police station where I lived and tell us when you see someone digging a hole in your front yard or on the road and is putting a bomb in the ground. Because if you don't, the next morning when an American convoy drives by, they're going to blow them up in that improvised explosive device. Influence operations is more deliberate than simply the public affairs and asking the questions. It's really about shaping their attitudes and their behavior, and it's long term. It's not something that can be done as quickly as when I pull the lanyard on a cannon. If I shoot an artillery piece, I know with good reason what that round is going to do when it blows up on a target. When I talk about influencing behaviors and attitudes, that's not a simple and repeatable process. It's not something that, as you know from your experience with cultural exchange, cultural diplomacy and exchange diplomacy, that you can simply do with a Zoom conversation. There's still value to bringing students to America, being immersed in that. There's still value in sending Americans overseas and building a pavilion at an exhibit, where then you can have volunteer ambassadors talking about America and the nuances and having that conversation. And that's how we build the connections that will lead to the influences we need. And we've sometimes taken this for granted in the past that, well, we've been in Germany since the end of World War II, so they must still like what we're doing and what NATO is. Well, if you look at domestic politics there and you look at the significant fewer number of American soldiers present in Germany than there were only 20 years ago, it has to be reassessed. And that is not simply engaging with the press, which is what public affairs does very well, but it's only one dimension of influence operations.
Okay, well, thank you, Greg. I was going to say, now I'm going to pivot back to one of my questions, and you were talking a little bit about appropriations and funding. And I was just going to say, during my tenure as Assistant Secretary of State for Educational and Cultural Affairs, the U.S. Congress created a special fund for countering state-sponsored disinformation through exchange programs. The purpose of the educational and digital literacy programs was to supplement countering disinformation efforts with an enhanced focus on the people, especially the young people who are most affected by the disinformation efforts. So I want to just say, after the careful research that you've done, what are your thoughts on the value of people-to-people engagement as part of USG strategy to counter state-sponsored disinformation?
I think it's a very important role. And so you have the social media piece to it that is very beneficial because you can reach more people quickly. The challenge with that is there is so much information out there that how do you know that your tweet from the State Department is getting into their feed? Who is retweeting perhaps what you are saying as the Assistant Secretary of State? And that may gain the traction. There is trouble when an evocative picture or a video taken out of context is shared in social media and it may not be really the clear message or explaining what happened in that event. It doesn't matter. It's what's popularly getting out there. And so there is value in building those people-to-people relationships, whether it's from an embassy or it's military soldiers training with other people, having a cultural exchange experience while they're deployed to a country like Thailand. But you're missing the opportunity if in that interaction, you're not asking them to carry a message forward or to ask certain questions to bring feedback that will allow us to understand if we're using the right social media platform, if our message is making sense to them, or if there are better ways that we can connect to them. We only get that through a person-to-person assessment.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'll add a little bit about the people-to-people exchanges, especially encountering state-sponsored disinformation. young people who come to the United States, it's an incredibly transformative experience for them. And they come back and they are actually have made up their own minds. We have in a few of the legislatures now inside of Eastern Europe, where we have up to 30% of our students that came in as high school students that are now up in parliaments. So this is an incredible example of young people becoming leaders and actually having critical thinking skills. So it's incredibly important. I now like to just ask another question here, again about the Global Engagement Center. As far as creating a central coordinating mechanism, separate from the issue of its current resources, do you think it's the right structure? Is it in the right place with the right mission?
It could be if the whole of government agrees that that's where we want the nexus to be. There may be value in considering putting it inside of the National Security Council, because then you're ensuring that it's getting there are greater collaborative efforts from across the government, from defense, from commerce, from agriculture, from any other agency, intelligence community member, or cabinet member that believes that they should be involved in this discussion, because they do have representatives of the US government who are going overseas. They're having wonderful engagements with people at a personal level. But are we using those relationships and all those opportunities together? And it may be that if you move it to the National Security Council, it would have the prestige that it needs to be taken more seriously and gain the attention from Congress, where of course all the appropriations come from. When Edward R. Murrow went to the US Information Agency in 1961, Kennedy brought him into the cabinet. He was a de facto member of the National Security Council. And that was very important because it ensured that when things went really well, it was because we considered public diplomacy as part of it, not just the operation itself, but the outcome of something like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then when Johnson and Nixon were president, they were much more sensitive to international criticism of America. And so they politely told USIA not to come to these meetings anymore. And they weren't considering the assessment. They were feeding information out there during the Vietnam War that wasn't necessarily accurate, but it met the interests of the administration. And so if you bring it to a National Security Council forum, then perhaps you'll have everybody around the table listening and contributing to that discussion.
Thank you very much. And I was just going to add one thing. When we had a chance to prepare for this exercise and remarks today, I was also thinking about Eisenhower, who of course comes from a military background. In the 1950s, he created a program which still exists today, which is really a people-to-people exchange. It's called the Sister Cities Program. I'm sure you've heard of that, where we've got thousands of cities around the world that are basically connected to the United States. So that's kind of another example of people with civilian getting together. So at this point now, what I'd like to do is again say thanks to the audience for all these great questions. And I'm going to go back to the chat and ask a question from the chat, which is, aside from information operations as a separate function, have public diplomacy considerations and imperatives been integrated into military planning in recognition that an operation or maneuver may have potential ramifications on freedom of action? One more time, aside from information operations as a separate function, have public diplomacy considerations, imperatives been integrated into military planning in recognition that an operation or maneuver may have potential ramifications on freedom of action? And that's a question from our audience today.
Sometimes it has. Sometimes it has not, because of the personality of the commander. There are tactical commanders in the Army who deploy a unit and they believe that their most important requirement is to bring all their soldiers home safely. Unfortunately, this is an inherently risky business, and there are some times where to accomplish the mission that we're required to do, we're going to put people into harm's way. And so to protect them, what we need to do is ensure that we're considering public diplomacy dimension of this. How well, if you were in Iraq for the 15 years that we were there, Were you working with the Civil Military Operations Center where there were different embedded teams from the State Department? Or did you say, well, they're there to deal with the governor and they're going to deal with the Ministry of Education, and I'm here to just drive up and down the streets and make sure there's no bombs? We're missing an opportunity for that. Going back to my Kosovo experience, which was really formative for me as a second lieutenant, I was looking for information operations doctrine, and everything was in draft. I left Germany for my 9-month deployment, and we had the UN mission to Kosovo in the area where we were working. We had a variety of non-governmental organizations, and my battalion commander was getting very frustrated that they were all out there doing their own thing. So we started inviting them to our camp. And once a week, we would have a leaders meeting. He'd invite them to lunch. It was a social event, but we would talk about, okay, how are the police chiefs being advised by the volunteer policemen who have come? How is the Ethiopian representative of the United Nations speaking to the minority leaders here in our area? How are we working together with the military who has, again, the ability to build these relationships? And if we're not building those relationships, we miss those opportunities. We come back protecting our soldiers, yes, for that 9-month, that year-long deployment, but what we're not doing in the long term is achieving those national security objectives that put us there in the first place.
That's great. Well, I think you must have done some good work in Kosovo, because in the Gallup polling, when we asked countries about their favorability towards the United States, of all countries in the world that are part of the poll, Kosovo comes in #1. And actually, when I met with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, she says they actually put up fireworks on 4th of July for our 4th of July. So that's pretty exciting. So you guys have done some really good work there. What now I'd like to also pivot to a question from a USC student. So here's the question. How can militaries integrate and effectively utilize social media in information warfare? This may require more targeted specialists on the ground that balances the overall strategic picture and targeted, relatable messages.
Yes, and that's hugely important. I think we focus too much money and investment in that at the cost of looking holistically at information operations, but it is very important. That has to be refined from one location to another. The Army has a component of the U.S. Cyber Command, as I mentioned, and they have individuals who are studying this from an intelligence perspective. There are cyber officers now, that's a branch of the Army, and they're looking at things from algorithms. How are you getting into someone's social media feed? And many times it's something that we simply want to get our message out there, but other times it is an offensive cyber capability that's important, because whether you're talking about ISIS recruiting or what the Russians or the Chinese may be doing in other parts of the world, there has to be a response to it. And the response may be a public statement by the US government, but a response could be something covert where we're simply finding ways to bury those stories or to discredit those individuals who are taking those conspiracy theories about the origins of COVID, for example, and getting them into legitimate news sources. And so there is a lot of investment that does need to be made in that. And it's just one, though, of multiple components we should consider.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. I want to pivot back to one of my questions, and it's really about the article again, and how you address the breakup of USIA in 1999 and the role of the BBG, the Broadcasting Board of Governors. So from your perspective and from the vantage point of 2 decades, was the dispersal of USIA elements to the US Department of State and the BBG a mistake? And the second part of that question is, does the breakup of USIA have any lessons for your discussion of dispersal versus consolidation of information in the military?
I think it would have been a good opportunity to keep the agency in 1999, but there was this hubris in the country, not just the government, but across the country, that the Cold War is over. People embrace democracy. But what we're seeing in public opinion polls, how we've seen nationalistic governments appear in Western Europe, not just Eastern Europe, it is indicating that what we took for granted at the end of the Cold War is not necessarily embraced by everyone in the world. And that was impacted by what the Russians have been doing, increasing what we're seeing the Chinese do. So right now, I don't think there's the political appetite to bring that agency back, but what we need to do is look seriously at where do those vestiges exist. The Broadcasting Board of Governors was changed to just a broadcasting board. The governors were dispersed. We've changed it to the U.S. Agency for Global Media. What is that? Who knows about that? There's a branding challenge. In the introduction from Jay, he introduced you as a former Assistant Secretary of State. Everybody knows what the State Department is. But if we took a poll of those watching right now, or of the USC students, and we said, what is the U.S. Agency for Global Media, what would they tell us? Would they know how many radio stations, international broadcasting components are there? If we ask that same audience, what does the Global Engagement Center do? Do you think that they are as good as the USIA's Division for Research and Analysis? You probably wouldn't get a lot of thoughtful answers, and it's simply because they don't know. They're not familiar with something because we took it apart in 1999. You know, the United States Army right now is challenged in Europe because at the end of the Cold War, after the Gulf War, we took tens of thousands of troops away from Germany. And now we have to deploy soldiers to Poland, to Czech Republic, to help enhance NATO because they don't see that visible presence as largely as they did 20 years ago. And so I think that that's something that we need to do is if we're not going to bring the agency back, we need to look at how to bolster all of those components that still exist. Is it more funding to the U.S. Agency for Global Media? Is it relocating the GEC to the National Security Council? But we have to hear from the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, ideas or at least questions. If they send those questions down to us who are staff officers and we provide input, then maybe that'll shape the direction where we go in the future. And when they go back to Capitol Hill for appropriations, they can argue for a requirement to give more money to help with the branding of the components of American public diplomacy today.
Thank you very much. I do want to share with the listening audience that the ECA, which was my bureau, had a record amount of funding. The U.S. Congress budgeted and appropriated $760 million for exchange programs in the areas of cultural, professional, and educational exchanges, which was a record. And the Broadcasting Board of Governors has a budget of over $800 million. So these are our large budgets with big reach. And again, with the GEC, you know, of course, they did receive funding, and I'm hopeful that they'll continue to have more targeted funding and an increase in that funding. But they've done a very effective job. At this point, I'd like to get close to a wrap-up time and also add that we've got some other important events coming up soon. But first of all, I would like to say thank you to you, Greg, for all of the comments and the article today. I think this is really a great discussion. You also made me just think of something else. You know, one of the things that is new, and I don't know if you're aware of this, because under me, we had the Cultural Heritage Coordinating Committee, which is all parts of the United States government, which works with the DOD, but they created a new program for Department of Defense called the Monuments Men and Women. I don't know if you know about this, but this is a program where if you are interested in helping support preservation of antiquities around the world for different countries, like we have with the Ambassadors Fund for Cultural Preservation, you can actually ask to be part of that in the DOD, where you can actually help protect those, for example, let's say you're in Iraq, for example. So those initiatives are really important, and I'm happy to see that the Department of Defense is continuing to do more things in the area of culture. And I also appreciate your thoughts on a stronger coordination between the DOD, BBG, U.S. Department of State. And also, I'd like to ask our listening audience to stay connected with us. I want to say again, thanks to Greg, thanks to Jay, thanks to the audience for all the terrific questions. And we've got some great speakers coming up. We've got Michelle Gaida coming up on November 10th. She's going to talk about home country as a stakeholder. And then we have on November 16th, Richard Wilkie. He will be speaking, and he's from the Pew Institute. But again, please keep looking out for our activities, and also please read Greg's article. And I believe, Greg, you also, again, wrote a book. Is that correct? Or just the articles? I'm trying to remember this, but how can they stay connected with you?
If they're interested in understanding what we used to do well, it's the U.S. Information Agency that I explore in the book Murrow's Cold War, where Edward R. Murrow served as John F. Kennedy's director of the U.S. Information Agency. And they can look at each of the major foreign policy crises of that administration through the lens of public diplomacy, from the construction of the Berlin Wall to the Cuban Missile Crisis to insurgency in Southeast Asia. What I find useful about that is just understanding what we did in the components and the approach to public diplomacy, where if we don't have USAID today, we can at least learn from that, because what we're seeing from disinformation campaigns and the sophistication of social media means that we have a lot of work to do.
That's great. And I think it's very heartening to know that a lot of these programs still exist. As far as on the exchange side, we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Fulbright program this year. And we have about 165 countries that are part of this program. And last year we had the 80th anniversary of the International Visitor Leadership Program. And I comment on that for our audience because last year I kicked off pre-COVID the beginning of the 80 Faces of Exchange. And I unveiled the first face of the 80, and it was Margaret Thatcher. And why Margaret Thatcher? Because she came as a young parliamentarian to the United States, and she stated basically that forever I will be a friend of the United States. And we have a letter in the Diplomacy Museum at the U.S. Department of State. And so again, that's an example of how important these exchanges are, and I'm so pleased that they continue, and also your efforts at the Department of Defense and your efforts to make information a priority. So I want to say thank you for that. And with that, I like to say again, I appreciate our amazing audience. I've learned a lot today, and I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you for participating.
Thank you, Marie, for having me.
You're
Appreciate
welcome.
it. Thank you, Jay, for the hosting.
Yeah, and thank you to Jay. Thank you.